If you're a man, or you know a man, or you've seen a man on TV, it's entirely possible that you may have heard about the concept of man flu, but you probably don't know whether or not it's real. The question is man flu a real, genuinely measurable scientific phenomenon, or is it just a hilariously derogatory way to describe the fact that when a man gets even a tiny bit of a cold, we are just completely laid out as if we're dying from the plague? One Dallas-Fort Worth woman told Texas Health, quote, "My husband puts on a hoodie and pulls it so tight he looks like that kid in South Park. Then he lies around unable to move or function." Another woman told the magazine, quote, "My husband tends to also develop a weird limp. It has zero to do with illness. He claims nobody has been sicker than he is." And closer to home, there's a picture of me somewhere wrapped up in a blanket on a recliner with my mouth, like, hanging open, just looking like an actual honest-to-God corpse. I looked for it, but I can't find it, and that is probably for the best for all of us. But suffice it to say that man flu is known to ravage even the most stereotypically sturdy of all specimens of man. And if by now you're really wondering whether or not any of this is real, whether you knew about it in the first place or not, you are in the exact right place, because we're going to go over the research right now and find out. I'm going to try really hard to avoid any screaming matches down in the comments, but one thing we need to say up front is that we do have data to suggest that there are variabilities in experience between the sexes when it comes to particular illnesses. It's also important to note that biological sex is not gender, and biological sex can also be complicated. We have a long history of medicine and medical research ignoring women altogether and treating them based on the results of studies done with all male subjects. And that's really harmful for both men and women. But that does seem to be changing for the better, at least slowly, and we can see some real differences in things like autoimmune diseases, cardiac events, and heart disease, osteoporosis, and other conditions, and they all have differing effects on male and female immune systems. There's also the data on lifespan and longevity. Global health data shows us that men tend to not live as long as women, which is true across all cultures and populations. Men are also more likely to come down with bacterial infections, and we're also more likely to have little parasite buddies and, not enjoy that so much. And then there's the data that shows us that during mass pandemics like the 1918 Spanish flu and more recently with COVID, men tend to die more often than women. We don't know exactly why, but if it turns out that men are more affected by disease than women, well, man flu could be a real thing then, couldn't it? This is doubly important because we see the same trend in the data about the seasonal flu. Flu tracking numbers tell us that men are more likely to be admitted to the hospital with flu-like symptoms, and they're also more likely to die from the flu. So we do have trends in the data that could be convincing in terms of whether or not man flu is a real thing. But there could also be other causes for all of those things too. So what real science do we have to tell us either way? A new study from just this year looked into the immune system differences at the cellular level. The team found genetic expression by sex differed in multiple ways, some of which confirmed prior studies, but others were previously unknown. All in all, 78 differentially expressed genes were found based on biological sex, which indicates that there's a lot more going on in terms of biological difference and immune response than we ever expected. We don't know a ton about what all the differences actually do yet, and the study was mostly focused on finding them in the first place, but they do offer some ideas about what might be happening and some other concrete mechanisms based on past studies. Like, for example, there are over 1,000 different immune system switches that activate immune cells in women that increase their body's inflammation response, and none of those are found in men. Other differences in sex-based gene expression are finding that the effects on male cellular activity had a lot to do with certain mechanisms like T-cell exhaustion, which led to more non-reproductive system cancers. And female cellular changes had more to do with immune pathway activation. And this is all really interesting because we're kind of seeing a flipped narrative here. If you'll notice, immune pathway activation and immune system stimulation is more associated with being biologically female. So inflammation response, for example, is much higher in women than it is in men. And inflammation is the body's own response to disease and trauma, and it's also what makes you feel so cruddy when you're sick. Overactive immune systems and chronic inflammation are associated with autoimmune diseases, and it's true that women are diagnosed with those more often than men. Lupus, for example, has a 9-to-1 ratio. For every one man diagnosed with lupus, there are 9 women who have it. From the data that we have available to us right now, it seems like the female immune response is stronger overall. And one self-reported Austrian study from 2022 actually showed that women reported more severe symptoms than men while afflicted with the common cold. But women also reported recovering faster from their symptoms. So maybe it's possible that the lingering effects of illness is what we see culturally as man flu? The study actually gives us an opening to talk about the issues with the way that man flu has been studied and why that's a problem for actually knowing anything definitive about it. Because a lot of the research is based on self-reporting, and that means that a lot of it is subject to cultural understandings or misunderstandings and also stereotyping. Even the physicians who were involved in some of the research had their own personal biases come through in some of the studies. For example, one study had shown that men over-reported the symptoms of their illness, which makes it seem like they're just whining, really. And the physicians who treated them went on to report that they felt that men in general get sicker less often than women do. So basically, the physicians themselves in this particular study are doing a cultural stereotyping thing where they believe that men should just be these sturdy physical beasts, as strong as the old trees of the winter forests. And so therefore, the real men they actually encountered in the study, even though they were presented with real data points, the researchers may have misreported or mischaracterized those data points based on their own personal beliefs and what they expected to find. And this is why a lot of the research in the area of man flu is difficult to fully verify or trust. It's just not really very empirical. The Cleveland Clinic echoes the same sentiment by telling us that the phrase man flu itself is all about assuming that men overstate the severity of their illness. And therefore, asking men to self-report their symptoms is a flawed initiative from the get-go. One of the physicians interviewed by Texas Health pointed out an additional factor that seems very believable to me in all of this. He said that it may relate to the psychosocial expectations for men. There is a difference between pain and suffering. Some men tend to suffer more for the same amount of discomfort. And this coincides with the data about how men are more likely to be admitted to the hospital with the flu. Right now, it's hard to say if this is because male immune systems are simply weaker. Is this maybe something that could be explained by a cultural refusal to seek treatment until symptoms are more advanced, at which point worse outcomes are gonna be expected? As the Cleveland Clinic tells us, men will do almost anything to avoid going to the doctor. And then there's the data on how men die more often in a pandemic. It could be that there's an underlying genetic difference that causes this, or it could be maybe men are more careless in these circumstances and don't take precautions as often as women do. I'm not at all saying that that's the reason, I'm just giving one example of what might be happening, as opposed to the possibility that men don't physiologically recover from pandemics as much as women do and are just more anatomically susceptible. Some of this just comes from cultural biases, like in the self-reported data, which is basically worthless for reasons of subject bias and also researcher bias. There's one study I found while doing the research for this where the guy looking into man flu said in an interview about it that he himself was just, quote, tired of being accused of overreacting. So he went looking for genetic differences in the mouse study he did, and he published it in the British Medical Journal in 2022, but he went deliberately looking for differences and a specific result, and it is worth mentioning that he did find that result. Surprise, surprise. But he did find it in a way that may not totally translate to what's happening in people, because he found that female mice release more corticosterone during illness, but human women don't use that for the same purpose. It's a glucocorticoid, and human people have cortisol for this same purpose. And cortisol can be released during an illness to lower inflammation and dampen immune response. So it kind of comes down to whether we can eventually find out if there's a similar thing happening in human women as a posed to mice women. Now, I did not find any studies about cortisol levels differing in men and women during illness, but there are studies about cortisol levels during stressful events, though, and for the most part, those are all pretty inconclusive about who is more stressed out than whom. And I've linked some of those studies down in the description if you want to dive into all that in more detail. At this point, I think it's fair to say that while we can't make any definitive conclusions just yet, we probably can also infer some small things from some of this. One of those being that it's likely that men are delaying doctor visits in general, which is leading to higher stats in things like deaths from serious illness or hospitalizations. Another possibility is that women may release more cortisol during illness, which could result in lower inflammation and just feeling better overall during the course of their illness, but we don't know that. And some of the data actually suggests that women feel worse when they get sick than men do. They just happen to recover faster. And also, the new data we have from our cellular level study shows us that women are more prone to inflammation and intense immune response in general, much more so than men are. So it could be that the lingering effects of illness that make men feel the so-called man flu phenomenon, like we're just beaten down over time when we don't get better fast enough. But that's not something that's been studied, and you'd also then have to see like a worsening trend of man flu symptoms toward the end of the illness than at the beginning. And I don't know that that's been tracked or discussed at all, and it doesn't really seem like a very likely thing. And you'd also have to assume that being sick for even just 2 weeks would make someone feel like they're just destitute forever. While it does seem like men and women may experience illness differently, as we've seen in the data, there are a bazillion factors involved here that we just don't have any real grasp on outside of the very few mechanisms that have been somewhat studied. Now, my gut instinct tells me that this is probably a more psychosocial issue like the Texas physician mentioned, but the differences in gene expression and immune activity certainly mean that something is different. But we can't definitively say whether different means worse in this case. The concept of suffering is just very difficult to pin down. So if man flu is a concern for you and you want to take something away from this exploration, I would probably suggest two main things. One is that if you're a man, go to the dang doctor, dude. Like, what are you doing? When you wait, you're just prolonging the inevitable and also increasing the chances of worse outcomes overall. So go get yourself some assistance from the professionals who went to school to give it to you. It doesn't make you weak or lame to do that. What makes you lame is putting yourself through unnecessary hardship and risking your health and safety by being an idiot. The other important thing here is that we need to keep pushing for more inclusive medical research. This is important for all members of the human family. As a cancer survivor who's been following the astounding developments in immunotherapy for almost 15 years now, it's easy for me to see that more individualized treatments are the future of medicine. There is no shoe that fits all comers. Not across big categories like biological sex. And as we're seeing more and more, this is true even for very small categories that only include you. So let's do some good, making medical research and healthcare much more inclusive and specific, because that's the only way we're going to solve real problems for specific people or groups of people like us man flu sufferers out there. I'll see you in the next one, unless I get a cold.